50 years of German-Chinese relation we celebrated last year. Most of these years were good relations, especially on the economic level. Now with the rising tensions with China, were we Germans too naive?
No, I don't think we were too naive. We were very hopeful, and some of these hopes, or many of these hopes, have been fulfilled, especially economically. I think China is now our biggest trading partner by far. We have been too hopefully, I think, politically. There has been a setback, an ideological, political setback in the last about 10 years. So there's a discrepancy between the still very good business relations and the very awkward political relations.
I think in hindsight, it's easy to say that we were naive. We just didn't know. China has undergone fundamental change, and many people in China were naive or did not know where China was going. So the fundamental question of whether China would be on a road to convergence with the Western democratic system, that obviously didn't turn out, and that surprised many Chinese. For a very long time, the Chinese system anticipated that they would not only have economic reforms, but political reforms. And I think many Chinese are as surprised as we are today that this has totally been turned upside down in the last 10 years under Xi Jinping.
But with all these geopolitical conflicts and the rising tensions with China, how should the German companies react? Would decoupling be a solution?
Decoupling is not a solution for most companies. The new slogan, and I think it's a good slogan, is de-risking. It's untangling the business relationship, keeping what works well, but making sure that the global business, that the existence of the company doesn't depend on success in China. Because obviously, business success in China today does not only depend on rising middle classes and so on, it depends on political developments, on the question whether foreign companies are welcome in China. And that can change. I think German companies should get as much business in China as they can, but they should be aware that this German-Chinese business love story of the last decades can end very suddenly.
I don't think we should try to decouple, but I think decoupling is taking place already. We are much more careful. We learned, or we're trying to learn the lessons of the Ukraine war. We learned that we were much too dependent on Russian oil and gas, and we all know that we are even more dependent on China. So there is more, I think, reluctance to engage further in China. And the Chinese also try to decouple a little bit from the West. So I think we'll see some decoupling, but it's not what we should wish for.
I think decoupling has not been discussed as a solution for any company. Decoupling is just a black and white tool, and the black and white tool doesn't work. So as we all say, it's a kind of de-risking issue. How can they de-risk their, at the time when China still is the biggest market? So that's the dilemma. So they have to start with a kind of puzzle on different stones of the puzzle where they could de-risk, what parts they could de-risk. Technological dependency, HR dependency, supply chain dependency. So they have to just look into 10 different tools they might have.
Mm-hmm. The German government is working on a China strategy at the moment. Some of its contents is already known. What impact do you think will this have, the China strategy, on the Chinese-German relationship, and also what this will mean for the German companies who are involved in China?
The German companies themselves are already discussing China risks for a long time. First the old risk, now the new risks. And I think the biggest effect of the China strategy is the awareness. Mm-hmm. So it's the awareness that we are not alone if we look into China risks, that politics and business might not be aligned all the time on how they assess the China risk, but at least it's the awareness and the discussions, and that's also helpful for the medium-sized companies and the smaller companies, that they are not alone and that they can discuss it in a framework of political support.
I don't think the strategy itself will change the relations. I think the reality is changing the relations and has been changing them already. China has changed, so our policy has to change too. I think that's a basic idea of this China strategy, but it's the reality that has changed relations, and the China strategy is kind of reacting to that situation. I think the fundamental change is, and this was shown by the Ukraine war, a new realignment between Russia and China on the one side. On the other side, we see a realignment in the West between Europe, Germany being part of that, the United States, and the democratic countries of Asia. And this will be reflected, I think, in this China strategy.
I think the immediate impact of the strategy when it comes out is going to be quite devastating. Everyone is going to be unhappy. Business is going to say that this goes too far. The opposition and maybe think tanks will say that it's too timid. The Chinese are going to be angry because it focuses too much on rivalry and doesn't emphasize partnership enough. So everyone is going to be critical of it. Nevertheless, I think it's fantastic that we had this process because we really put all arguments on the table. We discussed as intensely as never before how our relationship with China could be in a lot of different spheres, and that is a good process. It started a rethinking. Not all of that is going to be in the strategy in writing, but what is not in the strategy, but was part of the thought process, is just as important.
But will you expect more negative impact on German-Chinese business, or positive, even positive, or so-so? What can the German companies expect?
I think it's actually not about negative or positive. It's about a changing China, and I think it's a positive impulse for companies to start thinking about their China risk. That risk has changed, and they have to take it seriously. It's a hard process. It's a very hard strategic task for companies to reshape their global business and still get out of China, or with China, with their China business, what works well in the short term, and at the same time know that in the long term, China is going to be very different and they're not going to be as welcome there. Maybe or maybe not. The bets are changing, and they have to think about the bets that they're putting now.